Well, last week we began a new series entitled Basket Case, in which we are looking through the various points of the life of Moses. And our goal is to hopefully draw from some meaningful insights and some valuable principles from some of the things that he walked through to help us to walk more faithfully and maturely with Jesus. There's much about Moses and some of the events of his life and some of the challenges he faced and some of the leadership lessons he learned that many of us can connect to in some way. For example, last week we looked at the remarkable beginning of Moses' life in which he was given up for adoption. And of course, many of you know, I kind of went through that myself. The events surrounding his adoption process were a little riskier than my own, no doubt. And I certainly didn't grow up as a royal prince in a castle. I was more like a royal pain in a casa, which, as some of you know, that's Spanish for house. Now that I'm going to have bilingual grandkids down the road, I better learn a few Spanish words, I guess. But nevertheless, there was definitely something I can relate to. Moses' sister Miriam was one of the 5 courageous women who involved in the early events of Moses' life, who showed tremendous courage. That was kind of the primary theme last week. And we learned from her and from 4 other women in Moses' life that courage was about choosing the hard right over the easy wrong. And that's especially true when it comes to walking with Jesus in a world that's hostile toward his message or regarding his claims for one reason or another. Without courage, it is impossible to live by faith. And without faith, we know it's impossible to please God. And Moses would spend the last third of his life living exclusively by the kind of faith that required undeniable and unrelenting courage. And he no doubt was inspired, at least in part, by the women in the early stages of his life. However, long before Moses undoubtedly became a magnificent profile of courage in his later years of his life, we discover that he had a character flaw that kind of led to a very disastrous decision and sent him running for his life. It's a flaw that many people, many of us even here, struggle mightily with. And it's called unbridled anger. Now, anger, of course, is something that we all possess at times. And often that anger is not only justified, it's the righteous anger. In other words, instead of being angry because our pride is hurt or because we didn't get our way, it's an anger caused by the observation of some injustice or some evil or oppression that even angers God himself. However, it's one thing to be angry. It's another thing to leave that anger unchecked. When we fail to temper our temper, it leads to some misguided and disastrous choices that not only escalates the problem at hand, but results in consequences that we can't undo. And that's exactly what happened to Moses. Today we're going to look at that story and hopefully some principles that we can maybe put in place when it comes to dealing with anger. And we find the story in Exodus chapter 2. And quite frankly, it takes up very little space. Only a few short verses, but it's no doubt a memorable experience in Moses' life. And as we know, Moses is the author of the first 5 books of the New Testament, including Exodus. And so I'm sure with a little trepidation that he had to write this part of the story. Or at least, if not trepidation, at least some regret. And the story begins in Exodus 2, verse 11. I'll put the words up on the screen. Here's what it says. It says, many years later, this is the New Living Translation, many years later, meaning years after his birth and all the events we talked about last week, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews, and he saw how hard they were forced to work. And during his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. After looking in all the directions to make sure no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian, and he hid the body in the sand. The next day, when Moses went out to visit his people again, he saw 2 Hebrew men fighting. Why are you beating up your friend? Moses said to the one who had started the fight. The man replied, well, who appointed you to be our prince and our judge? Are you going to kill me as you killed that Egyptian yesterday? Then Moses was afraid, thinking, everyone knows what I did. And sure enough, Pharaoh had heard what happened, and he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh, and he went to live in the land of Midian, where when Moses arrived in Midian, he sat down beside a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters who came as usual to draw water and fill the water trough for their father's flocks. But some other shepherd had come and chased them away. So Moses jumped up and he rescued the girls from the shepherds, and then he drew water for their flocks. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked, why are you back so soon today? Well, an Egyptian rescued us from the shepherd, they answered. And he drew water for us, and he watered our flocks. And then, where is he? The father asked. Why did you leave him there? Invite him to come and eat with us. Moses accepted the invitation, and he settled there with him. In time, Reuel gave Moses his daughter Zipporah to be his wife. Later, she gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, for he explained, I have been a foreigner in a foreign land. So we're going to look at, just real quickly, just kind of pick this text apart with a few observations, and then we'll talk about the underlying theme of unbridled anger. The first thing that catches my eye about this text is the part of Moses' story in verse 11 where it said that the reason Moses took a walk in the city that day was because of his desire to observe what, quote, his people, unquote, are going through. It's obvious from this text, at least to me, that either at this time of his life or maybe somewhere leading up to this point, that Moses has been going through, or is going through, some kind of identity crisis. We know that thanks to the quick thinking of his older sister and the compassion and permission of the Egyptian princess who adopted him, that his birth mother weaned Moses for a time of 2 to 3 years. And in that time, she no doubt tried to teach him as much as she could about his Hebrew heritage and the monotheistic faith of the Hebrew people before turning him back over to his new royal adopted mother. But really, how much of that could he retain, right? I mean, how much could he be influenced by that at such a young age? How can that compare to all that he learned and that he was trained in regarding Egyptian culture and customs and religion and other influences? He may have looked like a Hebrew, but he no doubt walked like an Egyptian during much of his early life. In Stephen's famous sermon in Acts chapter 7, Stephen tells us that Moses was not only instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptian, but that he was mighty in word and in deed. In other words, he was intelligent and accomplished. He had made a name for himself in the royal court. He no doubt had the attention and the ears of very influential people in the royal household. Somewhere along the line, though, he must have undergone some kind of crisis of identity or conscience. Somewhere the conflict between his nature and his nurture, between his birth heritage and his teenage and adult upbringing, there was some conflict going on. And it leads me to wonder if maybe he was permitted to maintain some kind of connection and relationship with the birth family from time to time. Why else would he be dealing with it? Or was there perhaps some kind of longing within him to connect to his roots? Now, as an adopted child, I personally never really went through that much of a conflict. I was told at a very early age that I was adopted. I was even told my birth mother's name and as much information about my birth father as my mom had. It was about the age of 18 or 19, I did have what I would consider a few questions, though, mostly regarding health issues and what I might have to be on the lookout for, and maybe where my look come from, wondering if there was anyone who might have looked like me. But I don't ever recall being torn between the German heritage of my birth mother's family and whatever ancestral heritage my adopted parents are from. In fact, I don't even really know my mom's side. My dad's side is French, I believe. But my point is that those kind of roots was just never that kind of a big deal to me. Maybe I'm unique in that way. I don't know. Maybe I'm in the minority. In fact, I have a few other friends who were also adopted that did seem to a little more consumed by those thoughts than I was. Maybe, I don't know if that was a natural thing or just they pursued it because of some negative actions inside the adopted family or what, I don't really know. But there were a few times I wondered why I might have had some different personality traits than those that I shared a home with, but not enough to really pursue anything with a vengeance. In a very brief search, when I was 19, I visited and met the woman who fostered me for a couple of months before I was adopted, but that's really about as far as I ever pursued it. Again, like I said, I knew my biological mother's name was Kloffenstein. That's what my name was when I was born. And I remember seeing that name pop up, and yeah, it was funny just to say it than it is to hear. But I remember that name popping up in the newspaper from time to time, particularly with a young golf prodigy in Terre Haute named Ryan. And I considered searching him out and asking if he had a relative named Marcia, who was my birth mother's name, just out of curiosity. But I held back because, you never know what people knew and didn't know. You didn't know what kind of can of worms were going to open up. I mean, I was given up in the 60s when people tried to hide that kind of stuff from the family. So I didn't really want to kind of open up a can of worms that caused them issues in the family. Of course, as most of you know, my birth mother did eventually search and find me about 23 years ago, and I have a relationship with her and her family. And I also spent a little time with my birth father before he passed away 2 years ago. And as it turned out, Ryan is my cousin and was my cousin, still is. And I have since met him. In fact, he was the golf pro at home in Links for quite a time when I did meet him. In fact, just a few months ago, in this past basketball season, I actually met his brother Chad at a Clay City game. They were playing North, and Chad has a son that plays for North. So I got to meet him. I just so happened that I know the athletic director at North High School, and we were walking around in the concourse, and I asked her, hey, do you know this kid Kloppenstein, his dad, Chad? He goes, yeah, he's right there. I mean, 2 feet in front of me. So that was kind of interesting. I got a chance to get to know them. But anyway, my point is that I never really had any kind of identity crisis because of being adopted. I never felt any kind of unquestionable pull towards seeking that out. Then again, Moses, unlike Moses, I didn't have to witness the abuses that the people of my birth family had to endure right outside of my door like he did every single day. It's hard to imagine the kind of mental impact that must have had on him, on a very young, developing Moses as he got older. Was there a sense of overwhelming guilt that he was consumed by without knowing that the privileges he had were such far removed from the lack of freedom that his birth family had? We don't really know, but the writer of Hebrews 11 tells us that at one point, Moses refused to be identified as the daughter of Pharaoh. Now, whether this is speaking into a decision he made up leading up to the event of Exodus 2 or after he became a wanted man, we don't really know. If it did happen before, then it leads me to wonder what might have led to that. Obviously, this leaves us with quite a few unanswered questions. Nevertheless, whatever led to it, this identity crisis within Moses had taken root and had grown to the point where he felt he needed to take a closer look at what was going on that particular morning. Moses, who we believe authored Exodus, like I said before, testified that this observatory walk was to check in on his Hebrew brothers. And it wasn't long before he witnessed something that not only offended his sensibilities, but downright angered him. He observed a grave injustice when he sees an Egyptian taskmaster severely beating an Israelite slave. And then, in a fit of rage, just staying aware of his surroundings, he sees an opportunity to exact revenge on this guy. He killed him and he buried him in the sand. Acts chapter 7 suggests that Moses began to see himself as Israel's deliverer when the events of Exodus 2 take place. But if that is the case, it seems to me that this is a very misguided way to go about it. He was, at this point, as far as we know, still an Egyptian prince. It seemed that there may have been better ways to handle it. Unless he somehow became or felt ostracized from his Egyptian connections or sensed that it would be a useless endeavor, it seemed that maybe using his inside influence and attempting to take a more diplomatic approach might have been a better solution. Make no mistake, though, this anger was a righteous anger on Moses' part. What he witnessed was a critical injustice, no matter how common it may have been in that day. This kind of slavery was and is an affront to God, but Moses' reaction to it is anything but righteous. It may have come from a sense of injustice, but it also came from a sense of a place of pride and a misguided perception of power. Nevertheless, at first, it seemed he got away with it. If he was still sleeping in royal quarters at that time, though, I got to kind of wonder if he had a sleepless night the night before, wondering if the guards were going to come get him and take him off and execute him. Nevertheless, the following day, feeling assured that his status was good, he takes yet another walk. Perhaps he's hoping that this would be the beginning of starting some kind of revolution. But he comes upon another conflict. This time it's between two Hebrews. Knowing that a revolution would never work if the Hebrews themselves were not united, he inserts himself into the middle of their dispute, hoping to resolve it. Instead, he discovers two terrifying realities. First, his secret isn't such a secret after all. It's like eyes everywhere, right? This Hebrew slave knew what he had done the day before, and if he knew, then how many others knew? Or how far had it gone by this time? Well, very quickly we find out that it had gone all the way up to Pharaoh himself, and Pharaoh thought to execute his adopted relatives. And the second truth that Moses discovered is that whatever revolt he imagined himself leading or influence he assumed he may have had with the Hebrew people, in reality, he had no solid footing to stand on. Not only did he not have God's blessing in this effort, but he had no credibility with the people yet. In fact, judging from the Hebrew slave's sarcastic answer to this inquiry, asking him if he was a prince, he was now their prince, is obviously he had no credibility with him. To them, he may have been a Hebrew on the inside, but he was still a rich kid with a tremendous privilege who had never walked a day in their shoes. He had never endured the long hours of making bricks, or suffering the mental anguish or the physical abuse, or gone hungry, or identified with them in any way, shape, or form. He was still an Egyptian to them. Moses learned a valuable leadership lesson that day, but he also learned a critical life principle that's really the primary idea for our message, and here it is. When we express our anger, even righteous anger, in unrighteous or inappropriate ways, we lose credibility and we compromise our testimony. Whenever we express our anger in inappropriate ways, we lose our credibility and we compromise our testimony. Now, before elaborating on that, I want to finish out the story real quick. At this point, Moses concluded that he had no other option but to go on the run, right? Instead of the great revolutionary leader that he imagined himself to be, he's now a fugitive. Instead of a freedom fighter, he's now a refugee. He ends up in the land of Midian, and upon arriving, what's the first thing he witnesses? Another grave injustice. Boy, this guy just can't stay away from problems, can he? Right? I mean, everywhere he goes, people are fighting. He sees a country shepherd harassing several women who were simply trying to get water from a well to feed their own animals. Now, in Egyptian culture, shepherds were looked at as the lowest of the lowlife, and that no doubt would have been in the back of his mind. But in spite of the last physical conflict that he kind of entered into, Moses isn't gun shy or sword shy or whatever they called it then. In fact, he once again comes to the rescue. But to our knowledge, this time, it seems that he knows better than to go to such extremes. It looks like he's learning already. He seems to make his point without having to resort to violence. And he then continues this prince in shining armor routine by drawing the water for the ladies, who are no doubt impressed by his heroics. And they go back and they tell their father what happened. And here's the interesting part. Did you notice how they identified Moses? They identified him as an Egyptian, right? And I wonder why. I mean, was he still wearing Egyptian clothing? Did he identify himself as one in some way? Is there still perhaps this identity battle going on with them? We don't really know. But if he thought he had an identity crisis before, now he's about to add to that mixture. Born a Hebrew slave, raised an Egyptian prince, and now he's going to begin life as a Midianite shepherd. This was the beginning of God's great 40-year anger management plan for Moses. And it includes marriage. There's a great way to solve your anger problems, right? So we have this whole thing going on, and it's very interesting, Moses' chain of events here. But Moses' sense of lostness during this time is made even more evident by the name he gives his first child, Gershom. He named that child because the scripture says he was a foreigner in a foreign land. And at this point of his life, that was true in the physical nature, and it was also true in the spiritual one. Yet little did he know, however, that God was preparing him for something much bigger a few more decades down the road. But for now, let's go back to the problem that led to Moses' predicament. Anger expressed in such an inappropriate, even violent manner, a manner which destroyed his credibility and his testimony for the time being. As I mentioned earlier, anger is something we all deal with. And while there are times where our anger may come from a righteous place, one in which we are angered by the grave injustices that we see one human being inflicting upon another, or maybe by observing ways in which so-called Christians violate Christian principles, more often than not, our anger comes from a seed of pride or discontentment. But even righteous anger, expressed in inappropriate ways without God's directive or leading, is disastrous. Blowing up or burning down an abortion clinic in an effort to stop abortion, for example, is not an appropriate or righteous way to deal with the injustice of abortion. The Bible has a lot to say about dealing with feelings of anger, though, wherever they come from. And these thoughts provide the principles that we can draw from and establish a way to deal with our anger when we feel it building up inside of us. To look into this is important because, as James reminded us, the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. For that reason, he writes in James chapter 1, verse 19, second half of 19 and verse 20, that let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. James' admonition is by no means a new thought. It mirrors something that Solomon wrote in Proverbs chapter 16, verse 32, when he wrote, He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit or his own emotions, he's better than one who captures a city. And the admonition to be slow to anger is pretty much the Bible's way of saying count to 10, right? When you begin feeling like you're going to get to that boiling point. If not, we risk becoming a foolish person, according to Solomon in the book of Ecclesiastes chapter 7, where they do not be quickly provoked in your spirit, for anger resides in the lap of fools. And with an even stronger take on this issue of anger, Jesus said in Matthew 5, everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment, but whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. And by the way, that word fool comes from the word that we get our word moron at, just so you know. So you can't get away with saying moron either. So I kind of had an awakening the day I found that out. But anyway, he goes on to suggest that even our worship lacks validity if we haven't attempted to resolve an issue that when we're angry with someone else, whoever we might be angry with. One of the ways to avoid letting ourselves get angry is to keep things in perspective and simply just kind of let some things go. Proverbs chapter 19, verse 11 says, goodness makes one slow to anger, and it is his glory to overlook an offense. Now, people will do many stupid things to upset us and even violate our personal sense of right and wrong. But sometimes we just need to let things go. I know, for example, that when I'm driving on the road, I'm not perfect. I've certainly inadvertently pulled out in front of someone before or got in the fast lane when I had no business being in it. So when others do those things to me, I really have no right to get that upset. By just letting that go, by overlooking someone else's mistake or bad judgment, it not only prevents escalation or the risk of retaliation, but it's an honorable thing to do. It is to our glory that we do that. In the letter of Corinthians, Paul addresses the church of people who were getting so angry over certain issues that they began suing one another, dragging their squabbles into the public arena for the whole world to witness Christians who couldn't solve their problems internally or calmly. They were destroying their testimony to the world. And at one point he wrote in 1 Corinthians 6:7, to have such lawsuits with one another is a defeat for you. Why not just accept the injustice and leave it at that? Why not let yourself be cheated? That's a radical idea, isn't it? It's not an easy thing to do. Now, he's not advocating here to be a pushover or to be weak. Rather, he's underscoring the principle and the power of meekness. And meekness is a strength. It's the mark of the power of self-control and the ability to keep the bigger picture in perspective rather than getting caught up in the trap of trivial things. It reflects the capacity to see the forest for the trees. And when we choose that path, we prevent a simple issue from escalating out of control. Solomon wrote in Proverbs chapter 15, verse 18, he said, the hot-tempered man stirs up strife, but he who is slow to anger quiets contention. In other words, he keeps everything under control, and that's to his credit. And again in chapter 29, verse 11, he says, fools give vent to their rage, but the wise bring calm in the end. In other words, when one chooses not to give in to their anger, they not only prevent escalation, but they also lay the foundation for a proper solution. They demonstrate credibility in their Christian walk, and they project a stronger testimony. Another way to prevent anger from becoming a problem for us is to not allow ourselves to be involved in toxic relationships with people who are habitually angry. We all know people like that. I used to work for a guy like that. Proverbs chapter 22, verse 24 and 25 says, make no friendship with a man given to anger, nor go with a wrathful man, lest you learn his ways and you entangle yourself in a snare. We all know that the attitudes and behaviors of those we're close to can begin to rub off on us. If we're not careful, we can become them. And that's why abuse is often carried from one generation to another. Sometimes we just have to walk away from relationships that affect us negatively like that, whenever that's possible. Nevertheless, in spite of all of our efforts to avoid getting angry, there will be times when we just do get angry. Times when we should be angry. But there's a right way to handle that anger, and there's a wrong way. And Paul warns us in Ephesians 4 that when we allow ourselves to get angry to the point of expressing it in negative ways, we give the devil a foothold into our lives. But, he says, when we do get angry, even for justifiable reasons, be sure not to let that anger lead us into sin. That comes out of Ephesians 4, 26 and 27. And the truth is that Moses found out when we let our anger evolve into revenge, that only leads to regret and to remorse and deeper resentment and invites a cycle of retaliation. Instead of creating a path to healing, revenge just increases and extends the pain and the unpleasantness of the original violation. In fact, it's in our quest to punish someone else that we really ultimately punish ourselves. King David wrote in Psalm 4, he says, be angry, but do not sin. Ponder in your own hearts on your bed and be silent, Selah, which is the worship thing. He says, offer right sacrifices and put your trust in God. In other words, he says, when we encounter something that makes us angry, think it through. More importantly, take time to pray about it. And I know that seems like such a canned Christian response, typical Christian response. But prayer is such a critical part of dealing with anger for multiple reasons. Prayer calms our spirit and it puts our emotions in check. It reminds us that God is in control and he is the ultimate judge. It opens the mind to seeking a wiser, proper, and more effective response and resolution. And not only does it prevent us from walking a path of regret, but it invites a divine ally who sees what's ahead and can provide the wisdom to handle our anger in a healthy way and address the injustice with a more lasting, regret-free resolution. It teaches us to act instead of reacting. To act instead of reacting. Prayer also reminds us that sometimes God works through the unjust actions of other people and our responses to those actions to guide us to where he needs us to be. The story of Joseph is a reminder of that. I'm always fascinated by Joseph's response to his brothers when he finally meets them again. Right? His very brothers who sold him into slavery. And he told them, what you intended for my harm, God intended for my good. In other words, he saw the bigger picture. They had trouble believing that anyone could be that forgiving and that merciful and maintain that perspective. Multiple times he had to reassure them that he was not angry, which once again leads us to the most important reason for controlling our anger, because it helps us to maintain our credibility and to strengthen our testimony. Maintaining our emotions in situations that trigger our anger is what has the potential to make us unique. It shines a light on God's glory instead of exposing the darkness that might lie within. And when we're willing to keep the bigger picture in mind and let some of the trivial things go, when we're determined not to be ruled by our anger and dedicated to the proposition to respond to injustice and oppression in righteous ways, then we play a critical part in not only glorifying God, but also in advancing his kingdom. Because everyone, just like Moses found out, there's always somebody watching. So let's pray.